Gear Solid is so freaking cool, man. From the entertaining gunplay, to the globe-trotting set pieces, to the absolutely amazing voice acting, to the groundbreaking game design, there's a lot to love about nearly every entry in this franchise. Hey, you! Come on, man! You already used this intro! You half-baked, totally pointless, Jacob Geller, Ask Your Uncle, Golden Bolt, Your Favorite Son, Breadsword wannabe hack! Figure it out! Oh. Well then. It's like the man said. Back in December of last year, I put out this video about the NES port of Metal Gear, and that video was received pretty well. I had originally planned on using it for a jumping off point for a sequel comparison video, where I went over the differences and similarities between each entry in the franchise, all in one swoop. But plans for that quickly fell apart, and I kind of just left that project on the shelf for some other time. There are plans to revisit that concept in the pipeline, it's just taking a bit longer than I would like to figure out the production side of that video. In many ways, this video will be a sequel to that one, and while I won't be harkening back to that one too much, I will be referencing these games a few times here, so if perchance you either haven't watched that video yet, or it's been a while since you've played either of these games, consider doing so before you proceed too far into this one, so that it's all fresh in your mind. Or you can do absolutely none of that and just let me explain everything to you. That's perfectly fine too. I'm here to talk about video games, not judge your playtime habits. So, after the release of the NES port of Metal Gear, and its non-canonical sequel, Snake's Revenge, Hideo Kojima took a particular dissatisfaction with them and reunited the team that produced the original MSX game with the goal of creating a true sequel that would carry forward his themes and ideas. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake would then drop in Japan on July 20th, 1990 on the MSX2 to near universal acclaim, being touted by many review outlets to have surpassed the original in nearly every way, save for an issue of backtracking that would unfortunately carry over into many future titles anyway. The game sold over 1.3 million copies within its first year, and after completing some personal projects, an action mystery game called Policenauts in 1994, and a dating sim called Tokimeki Memorial Drama Series Volume 1 in 1997, Kojima was once again brought to the table to work on yet again another Metal Gear game. However, the team was not just willing to work on another 2D sprite-based game, and started looking to new technological achievements to put their work on. Enter the Sony PlayStation, with its polygon-based production hardware and streamlined developer programming, and you had a match made in heaven. Production began right away on a soft reboot sequel for the Metal Gear franchise, and in 1998, we got the revolutionary debut of Metal Gear Solid. Development for MGS1 was conceptualized during production of Policenauts, and the two games went on to share multiple assets in their final iterations. Technology, level design, and even some characters' names and appearances were similar in both games, however, each with their own distinct style. Metal Gear Solid was developed to be a stealth action game, with realistic set design and similarities to then modern military structure. During production, several staff teams were given lectures and interactive sessions with international military advisors on the topics of explosive ordnance, vehicles, and tactical weaponry, to create a lifelike appearance of those assets in the game. Characters, as well as the infamous Metal Gear Rex, were designed by a man named Yoji Shinkawa, as requested by Kojima based on previous abstract work that he'd seen in passing. This distinctive brush-like design made the art in the game feel almost speculative, and allowed the 3D artists for the game to really iterate on and have fun with the models that ended up in-game. Everything in the game was animated by hand, with the art staff refusing to use then budding motion capture production, and instead opted to stylize everything traditionally. Level design was personally overseen by Kojima himself, who would regularly sit in on meetings and map creations through production. The team famously used Lego bricks to conceptualize the levels as they were designing them in-engine, and used a webcam to view the game from the player's perspective as to make sure their design wasn't convoluted or messy. In the end, all their efforts in pre-planning would pay off immensely, as Metal Gear Solid received damn near perfect scores from multiple review outlets across the board, and sold over 1 million copies in just 3 months. History still looks back on Metal Gear Solid with nostalgic glory. This game is often cited to be the source of popularizing the stealth action genre in America, and with the release of games like Siphon Filter, Fear Effect, and Spec Ops Stealth Patrol, it's kind of hard not to see why. Action game developers wanted to capture the same kind of energy as Kojima Productions were able to in their titles, though you could never really find the same quality in other games around this time. Mechanics here are very smooth and easy to grasp, the plot twists are both aggravating and thrilling, and the soundtrack and voice work in this game are some of the best in the genre entirely. Review outlets like Game Informer, Famitsu, and IGN regularly call upon this game in their top 10 lists about action games and PS1 titles in general. In October of 2012, the Smithsonian American Art Museum placed MGS1 and its sequel, Sons of Liberty, in its Art of Video Games exhibition. In August of 2015, Eurogamer wrote an article that examined MGS1's technical achievements and the impact it had on the industry, and later declared the game as, quote, nothing less than the first modern video game. In May of 2023, GQ magazine heralded Metal Gear Solid as the 7th best video game of all time, according to a panel of video game journalists across the industry. After Metal Gear Solid released in 1998, Kojima Productions set to work on fine-tuning future releases of the game, including a PC port, a version with expanded content called Integral, and a special side mission disc with a catalog of 300 virtual reality training levels called Metal Gear Solid VR Missions. Official production for a sequel to the original began in 1999, and Kojima again found himself pursuing the digital horizon in video game technology. Instead of creating a game for the same console, the team shifted gears and instead began developing for the PlayStation 2. With a bigger technological scope, the production of the game also rose to greater heights. The team implemented new design points, like stashing enemy sentries' bodies, shadow and noise detection, larger maps with multi-level verticality, and new soldier AI designed around squad-based encounter tactics. The gameplay in Metal Gear Solid 2 was seen as a massive improvement and a logical step forward compared to what came before, especially with the surprising processing power allotted by the PS2. While the narrative for MGS2 was given heavy criticism, the 3D level design just came naturally to this kind of game, and with all the new features allotted to the dev team, it was difficult to see the franchise headed in any other direction. Even more so with Hideo Kojima himself publicly stating multiple times that MGS2 would be the final project he'd ever work on for the series. For a time, the franchise was in pretty good standings. But then, something began to fester beneath the surface at Konami. Or should I say, Nintendo. In 2003, Nintendo of America announced a new project in the Metal Gear franchise titled The Twin Snakes, being developed by Canadian video game studio Silicon Knights. Konami would be on board to publish the game, released exclusively on the GameCube in March of 2004. The Twin Snakes is a top-to-bottom remake of MGS1, using the graphics engine of MGS2 and given a complete mechanical overhaul. Very few of the original development staff from Kojima Productions contributed with the game, but the big hitters were all still involved. Yoji Shinkawa returned for updated character and environment art, Tomokazu Fukushima rewrote some of the dialogue, Norihiko Hibino assisted Stephen Hennepin in composing an entirely new soundtrack, and Hideo Kojima contributed as a producer alongside Yoshikazu Matsuhana and Dennis Dyack. Because of the diversity of its staff, much of the old blood from the original game was infused with that of the new, modern developers, and the end product definitely reflects in that aspect. Twin Snakes wasn't the first game in the Metal Gear franchise to have been made by an outside developer, and it wouldn't be the last. But what's notable about it is the sheer amount of creative differences in the final product that gave it its own identity within the series. The game received mostly positive reception from reviewers, citing the new graphics and visuals as improvements upon the original, but was criticized for reckless additions of mechanics from MGS2 and a swath of frame rate drops across the entire game. Despite this positive acclaim upon release, the Twin Snakes is often heralded by the fans as an absolute disaster. As you can probably tell by the title of this video, I wholeheartedly agree with this sentiment, and will be going to extreme lengths to attempt to explain why. Because while on its surface, this game appears to be an entertaining reimagining of the PS1 classic, it's very apparent from even the first 10 minutes of gameplay that Twin Snakes is an atrocity that can only muster the strength to live in the shadow of the rest of this franchise. So much of the original's heart and soul is trampled upon in this remake, and is very unapologetic about its own nature. Very few games withstand the test of time like that of Metal Gear Solid, and is a joy to play on modern hardware as the years roll on. But this thing? This abomination? I went out of my way to purchase my own GameCube and searched a handful of retro gaming stores that were states away from where I live before even finding a copy of this thing. I shelled out $120 for this thing just to sit down and experience it for myself. It was the longest, slowest, cringiest playthrough of a game I have ever had. I constantly felt betrayed and antagonized as I watched this thing tear down one of, if not my actual favorite game of all time, and I was struggling to do anything more but push forward. I needed to see this thing through to conclusion, and now I'm going to make you guys take that journey with me today. So strap yourselves in, folks, cause it only gets worse from here. I'm going to take you guys through each game, comparing mechanics, graphical and audio design, and changes in the narrative. And by the end of it all, I'm hoping to have demonstrated why I think Metal Gear Solid has a bad remake. So naturally, I imagine that the first thing a lot of people are going to bring up is the fact that I'm comparing two different video games from two different hardware generations, and how that's an unfair comparison to make because of the limitations of one severely handicapping it against the other. And to that I say, you're right. I'm giving a major handicap to the Twin Snakes here. I mean, come on, a 6-year technological difference, that's insane. Seriously though, I need you guys to understand the weight I'm applying to the first game's legacy here. We're talking about the granddaddy of modern stealth action military thriller games. The Metal Gear franchise has been a solid rock that stood out against the test of time, against the many comings and goings of video game trends and multi-million-dollar conglomerates changing hands and staff across decades. Among critics and players alike, Metal Gear Solid as a game is a foundational building block and is often sought to as the gold standard for this type of game. Sure, it has its quirks, and you can definitely poke a few holes in the narrative, but aside from the obvious graphical downgrade, the first game can go toe-to-toe with many of the same kinds of games in today's gaming landscape. I won't be holding back in criticisms on either sides here, and that's mostly because I think this game can take it. This one deserves all of the hate I'm about to give it, and this one can stand all of the blows that I can dish out. Right away, the first thing I want to point out is each game's graphics and presentation. In MGS1, most of the game takes place from a camera that looks down at the level as the player proceeds. This is a habit brought over from the previous MSX games, which took on a similar approach. The overhead camera changed in certain circumstances, like when the player goes down a narrow hallway, or is ascending and needs to see ahead of them. Rarely is the camera ever actually behind the player, and it's usually done for cinematic qualities. Compare that to the Twin Snakes, where the camera angle constantly changes. In a level where there's hallways or corridors, the camera will constantly adjust smoothly from overhead to angled, but always focusing on the player. In this way, with the addition of smoother movement in general, you never feel like you're stuck looking at something you don't want to while you play. MGS1 had a lot of specific camera angles when they wanted to highlight stuff, but it did always feel pretty rigid. Unless you used the first-person view mode, or were trying to peek around corners by pressing against the edge of a wall, there really wasn't a good way to examine the environment. This is perhaps one of the Twin Snakes' strongest points, and it excels at providing new and interesting ways to look at the old world that we used to know. Several stages have similar mirrors to their original, but plenty of maps have altered camera angles too to show off the subtle details. Playing the two games are also worlds apart, as MGS1 is basically just the launch pad for the enhanced mechanics present in the Twin Snakes. On the original PlayStation, characters in a 3D environment could only move in 8 directions: up, down, left, right, and diagonally on each plane. This meant that a lot of the design in MGS1 is very square. Travel paths along the levels are usually in a grid, except for rooms with 2 stories where they usually implement balconies to traverse them. Even most boss fight encounters, save for a few that don't require the use of a gun to finish, are done in an enclosed square space to take the most advantage of the clunky shooting controls. Players will be most comfortable using the D-pad to navigate levels of MGS1, but in the Twin Snakes, the analog stick is the preferred method of travel. This is because the stick in the game applied a much more modern take on movement controls, allowing the player to easily glide and swerve in whichever direction they want as they move around. You'll also find a lot more varied terrain in Twin Snakes, with multiple levels, gaps in the floor, and additional hazards to navigate during the campaign. A lot of the control scheme in this game is a direct step up from MGS1 and is seen as an obvious progression. There are more movement directions, the running speed is faster, enemies can hear players' footsteps from farther away, the player can hang from ledges, you could tiptoe to look over cover to aim and shoot guns, and some props in the environment were changed into objects you could hide within, like this conveniently placed locker right in the guard's patrol route. Unfortunately, that's kind of where the pleasantries end for Twin Snakes, because while this new control scheme is definitely superior compared to MGS1, the change in mechanics is embarrassingly met with a lack of change to the level design to compensate for it. In MGS1, you'd find stages where there's more than one story, separated by a balcony or a ladder, that forced the player to go on one of a couple paths to get to the exit. This meant the player had to plan timing to observe enemy patrol routes to weave past security undetected. You had to stop, observe, and use your tools at your disposal to make it through. But in the remake, the player is given much more freedom of movement. Perhaps a little bit too much freedom to advance through the stage. Thanks to the additions of first-person gun aiming and the hanging mode, multi-level areas are a breeze to swing through. All you have to do to get through an area without being spotted is to take position at a spot with watch over the rest of the level, take aim with your gun, and pick off the enemies from a distance. Then, instead of finding one of 2 staircase routes, you just drop over the balcony ledge and gun it for the door. Granted, the nuke storage building forces the player to keep all their weapons holstered, but in the other places where this matters, like the tank hangar, the blast furnace, and even Rex's lair, navigation is a breeze and enemy encounters become incredibly trivial. Boss encounters in the Twin Snakes are also frustrating in this regard. With the new mechanics, but the same level design, methodology that used to work in the original is simply outdated now. The player wasn't able to aim their guns in first person in MGS1, but in the Twin Snakes, you can. So when you take on Ocelot in this stage, you used to have to chase him to get a good shot in every now and again. But now, all you have to do is take cover behind a pillar, wait for him to peek out to take a shot at you, then do the same with the trigger buttons while aiming your gun, and you could take him down in seconds. In the Vulcan Raven fight, he used to be able to blow up explosives that you set traps for him with, be it claymores or C4. This doesn't seem to happen in the Twin Snakes, and funnily enough, you can actually take him on with more weapons now, namely the enormous quantity of stun grenades that you likely have by this point in the game. Oh yeah, that's right. One of the featured challenges of every game after MGS1 is an alternative playing style where the player is given non-lethal weapons and are tasked with not killing a single enemy in the entire run. If the player succeeds, they're given a special rank at the end of their playthrough. This is a neat little trial the player can give themselves, essentially acting as a handicap to make the run harder. But this is also thematic in a few ways, as it imposes an ideology that the characters in the Metal Gear franchise have to grapple with regularly, and that's simply the consequences and morality of taking other people's lives. With the introduction of this playstyle in the Twin Snakes, certain boss fights become downright trivial, as a combination of non-lethal weapons will bring them down faster and sometimes even easier. One thing I wanted to mention before we move on is the absolutely grueling test of reflexes that the first game gives the player just before the halfway mark of the game. After Meryl gets shot and captured, Snake meets a similar fate after seemingly taking down Sniper Wolf. After being captured, Ocelot sadistically tortures Snake by strapping him to a metal platform and electrocuting him. This part of the game is not scripted, and the player has to actually engage with a minigame in order to proceed. To survive the torture, the player has to vigorously mash the circle button for the duration of the electrocution, keeping Snake's health gauge up. In MGS1, this torture lasts 8 rounds, back to back, across 2 sessions. Of course, the player can give up at any time by pressing another button, but doing so will change the game's entire ending, as well as many conversations throughout the second half of the game. This scene is absolutely brutal, and is likely the reason for countless broken controllers and many players' button mashing skill development. The amount taken out of the health gauge is substantial, and the amount of time the player has to mash is extended in every subsequent round. But in the Twin Snakes, all of this difficulty gets washed away. The player starts the game with a fully completed health gauge, the amount restored by mashing is much greater, there's only 6 rounds, and the A button on the controller is so huge you can easily mash with 2 different hands if you wanted to. In the original, this part of the game always got to me, and I could never do it on my own until I was well into my teens. I either just sucked it up and took the Otacon ending, or I got sneaky and used a spoon or a pen cap to destroy the circle button with. But this remake's version of the torture sequence is just child's play. I didn't need another tool, I didn't need 2 hands or fingers. I just had to go at it for a decent pace until it was over with. Didn't even really break a sweat, and for some reason, that bothers me. Don't get me wrong, there's still a fair amount to like about actually playing the Twin Snakes. A lot of the old Easter egg mechanics from MGS1, and even some from MGS2, are integrated into this game. For instance, if the player wears the gas mask while underwater at any point, the player will get an extended time on the O2 gauge. You can shoot these Mario and Yoshi statues in Hal's lab for sound effects and health restores. Calling Mei Ling too many times in a row without saving makes her angry, and she refuses to let you even try a time after that. If you complete a certain amount of hanging pull-ups, or perform a hang-drop-hang maneuver a few times, you can upgrade the grip gauge for your playthrough. All of these neat little hidden, niche interactions are just too little of an additive to make the glaring game design flaws go away. They took the fluid, modern controls of a Metal Gear game like MGS2 and 3 and implemented them into the outdated, standard level design of MGS1 and really didn't do anything to compensate for it. And because of that, what used to feel like an epic adventure with the odds stacked against you by real danger now feels like a walk in the park with the occasional pothole you're supposed to look out for. And that's really frustrating for a game series that thrives on making players think first, keeping them guessing as they push on. When production for the Twin Snakes began, the sound team came across a massive issue in regard to character dialogue in the cutscenes and codec call segments. See, the original plan was to use MGS1's voice work across all languages in an attempt to save money and avert a potential issue in recasting the actors. However, it was discovered during the game's development that all of the original recorded voice work was polluted with additional noise and breaks in the tracks, which was a disappointing result due to the advancements in audio engineering technology since MGS1's creation. So the staff were faced with a decision. The goal was to produce the game in a reasonable amount of time and not blow a full-length game's budget on a remake, and some voice actors had either aged, died, or simply retired. The final decision ended up being the total re-recording of the game's dialogue in American English, with different languages subtitles displayed on screen during the cutscenes and codec calls. David Hayter, the voice actor for the main character Solid Snake, signed on immediately. However, it was clear during production that they simply wouldn't have enough money to rehire all of the original cast, and were going to need replacements. Hayter famously negotiated with Konami and his co-workers during this time, taking a massive pay cut himself in order to sufficiently compensate the rest of the voice talent. The only change made to the roster was Rob Paulson coming aboard to replace Greg Eagle's role as Gray Fox. I'm sure that I'm far from the only person to have made this complaint before, but the voice acting in the Twin Snakes is atrocious. Like, it's dishearteningly bad. Right away you could tell that the heart and soul of the actors had just been drained. MGS1's localization in America was treated like a last-ditch effort. Not many people were even aware that a sequel to Metal Gear was being produced for an international release right up until they started pushing trailers, and as a result, the direction for its voice work was very deliberate and exacerbated. They really got into their roles and took themselves super seriously. Characters were allowed to get very expressive whenever something surprising or shocking happened. Explanations and threats were nuanced, letting the player know what key words were most important, and also how serious a person was by where they exaggerated their syllables. When Snake was pissed, you got pissed off too. When Campbell was lying, you knew by the way he prolonged certain words. When Naomi was hurt or upset, her fragile cadence began to fall apart. When Liquid was making fun of his brother, you could get secondhand embarrassment and want to get back at him. This cast really put in an effort here, in every single scene, in every single delivery. But for some reason, in Twin Snakes, it sounds like the actors have literally anywhere else to be, and listening to them physically hurts. During the original opening briefing monologue, Paul Eiding comes off as if he's delivering awful news. Like this information he's giving to Snake is terrifying and of the utmost importance. There's fear in his voice, knowing that what's happened is grave and is to be taken seriously. In the remake though, it feels more like he's just reciting lines, like he's giving a lecture to somebody and is expecting them to absorb the information for a quiz later.
You'll have 2 mission objectives. First, you're to rescue DARPA Chief Donald Anderson and the President of Armstech, Kenneth Baker. Both are being held as hostages.
You'll have 2 mission objectives. First, you're to rescue DARPA Chief Donald Anderson and the President of Armstech, Kenneth Baker. Both are being held as hostages.
In fact, that's kind of how all of Eiding's lines are throughout this game. The conversations that used to be so dire, so serious and important, sound completely flat and are missing all of the urgency. When the hostages die unexpectedly due to a supposed heart attack...
A heart attack? No.
Colonel, are you hiding something from me?
Absolutely not. Snake, you've got to understand. This op is security level red. You need the highest security clearance to get access to the complete file.
A heart attack? No.
Colonel, are you hiding something from me?
Absolutely not, Snake. You've got to understand. This counter-terrorist op is security level red. You'll need the highest security clearance to learn the real story.
When Snake gets captured and Campbell is forced to lie about the new nuclear missile...
As far as I know, as of yesterday, the President had not been briefed about the Rex project.
Need to know basis, is that the idea?
These are sensitive times. Even subcritical nuclear tests are causing quite a stir.
As far as I know, as of yesterday, the President had not been briefed about the Rex project.
Need to know basis, is that the idea?
These are sensitive times. Even subcritical nuclear tests are causing quite a stir.
When Master outs Naomi as a possible enemy spy after beating Raven...
If she's one of their spies, then we're in big trouble.
What do you mean?
Nothing.
Have you let her in on some kind of vital secret or something? Does this have anything to do with the mysterious deaths of the DARPA chief and the Armstech president?
I have no idea.
If she's one of their spies, then we're in big trouble.
What do you mean?
Oh, nothing.
Colonel, have you let her in on some kind of vital secret or something? Does this have anything to do with the mysterious deaths of the DARPA chief and the Armstech president?
I have no idea.
Or after Liquid has successfully activated Rex and Campbell threatens to launch his last option if Snake fails to subdue them.
Destroy Metal Gear! We're out of time! If you can't do it, I'll have to resort to my last option.
Last option?
We have a submarine prepared to deliver a full nuclear strike on the base.
What the hell?
Destroy Metal Gear. We're out of time. If you can't do it, I'll have to resort to my last option.
Last option?
We have a submarine prepared to deliver a full nuclear strike on the base.
What the hell?
All of these are very important, very intense lines that got quashed by a flat performance with barely any emotion. The only lines that I can say have any emotion at all are the ones right after Meryl gets shot by Sniper Wolf and Campbell begins to panic. But even these aren't given the same kind of intensity, with pronunciation in the right places to convey his desperation.
Meryl! Damn. Snake, it's a trap. The sniper's trick to lure you out. The sniper's waiting for you to go and help Meryl, so he can pick you off. Don't do it.
Meryl!
Colonel?
Damn! Snake, it's a trap. A sniper's trick to lure you out. The sniper's waiting for you to go to help Meryl so he can pick you off. Don't do it!
I want to say that this was all just a symptom of Aiden getting older or something, but he even sounds this way in MGS2, which came out only 3 years earlier. It was fine over there, because whether he knew it or not, the Campbell he portrayed turned out to be an artificial intelligence bot, and was intended to sound a little stoic.
They landed on the roof of the big shell as planned. And by the way, Snake, we're changing your code name for all following communication.
What's wrong with Snake?
Just a precaution. You are now designated Raiden.
But here, where he's supposed to be a real person, it just leaves a lot to be desired. Other actors, like Cam Clark and Chris Randolph, were more successful in keeping their characters intact. Despite the changes in some of the dialogue, a majority of their lines still carries the same weight as in the original. Otacon still gives off plenty of crybaby emotions when the bad things happen throughout the game.
What did our president do? If the terrorists launched that thing... Damn! Damn! I'm such a fool. It's all my fault.
What did our president do?
If the terrorists launched that thing... No. Damn! Damn! I'm such a fool. It's all my fault.
Liquid comes off as snide and derogatory, like someone who's holding all of the cards and knows what's in his opponent's hand.
Or should I say, Big Brother? I'm not sure. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You and I are both the last surviving sons of Big Boss. Or should I say, Big Brother? I'm not sure. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You and I are both the last surviving sons of Big Boss.
Sometimes the emotional urgency finds a hiccup or two, like when Snake is pressing Otacon for information in his lab and picks him up by the collar.
I already know that Metal Gear is nothing but a nuclear-equipped walking deathmobile.
Nuclear? What are you talking about?
The terrorists are planning to use Metal Gear to launch a nuclear missile. You telling me you didn't know?
They're gonna put a dismantled warhead into Metal Gear's TMD missile module?
Wrong. I already know that Metal Gear is nothing but a nuclear-equipped walking deathmobile.
Nuclear? What are you talking about?
The terrorists are planning to use Metal Gear to launch a nuclear missile. You telling me you didn't know?
Aren't they just trying to use the TMD missile module to launch a disabled nuclear warhead?
Wrong.
Or when Liquid explains his inside knowledge of Naomi and the Pentagon, and it sounds like the two of them are sitting across from a table at each other having a conversation, when in reality they're several feet apart in a gigantic hangar, and somehow there's just no echo?
So I could manipulate you more easily. And you performed quite well, I must say. Although the boys at the Pentagon are probably saying the same thing.
What the hell are you talking about?
So I could manipulate you more easily. You performed quite well, I must say. Although the boys at the Pentagon are probably saying the same thing.
What the hell are you talking about?
Aside from Aiding, the actresses for Mei Ling, Naomi Hunter, and Nastasia Romanenko all suffer in their characterization due to a suppressing of their international accents that were in MGS1. Kim Mai Guest, the actress for Mei Ling, completely changed her thick Chinese accent into a more stereotypical young woman voice.
Snake, they've placed the colonel under arrest. I don't know what I should do. This will probably be your last save.
I'm going to miss those proverbs of yours.
Snake.
Mei Ling, I have a favor to ask you. Make a hard copy of all the codec conversation data up to this point. I want some insurance.
Okay, Snake, leave it to me.
Snake, they've placed the colonel under arrest. I don't know what I should do. This will probably be your last save.
I'm gonna miss those proverbs of yours.
Oh, Snake.
Mei Ling, I have a favor to ask you. Make a hard copy of all the codec conversation data up to this point. I want some insurance.
Okay, Snake. Leave it to me.
Jennifer Hale seemed to be trying out a new direction for Naomi, which she would later use in MGS4, but just came off as being super depressed and barely vocal at all.
Yes. Frank Yeager. The man who you destroyed was my brother and my only family.
No. Gray Fox?
We survived that hell together, Frank and I. He protected me. He's my one connection. The only connection I have to my past.
Yes. Frank Yeager. The man who you destroyed was my brother and my only family.
No. Gray Fox.
We survived that hell together, Frank and I. He protected me. He is everything to me. The only proof I have of my existence. Of my existence as an individual.
Renee Raudman, the voice of Nastasha, still managed to hold on to her Ukrainian accent, though it is noticeably much less thick.
This is Nastasha Romanenko. A pleasure to work with you, Solid Snake.
You're the nuclear specialist that the Colonel mentioned?
That's me. You can ask me anything about nukes that you want. I am also a military analyst, so I have an extensive knowledge of weapon systems as well.
This is Nastasha Romanenko. A pleasure to work with you, Solid Snake.
You're the nuclear specialist that the Colonel mentioned.
That's me. You can ask me anything about nukes that you want. I am also a military analyst, so I have an extensive knowledge of weapon systems as well.
And of course, there's the talented David Hayter as well, returning to voice the Grizzly War veteran, Solid Snake. Hayter's portrayal of Snake was immediately iconic, establishing his character in video game history and moving further the stereotypical gruff soldier man. But honestly, I couldn't see this character in any other light. By the time MGS1 rolled around, Snake had gone from rookie stealth mission operative to retired military legend. He'd have aged somewhere older than a spry 20-something, and would have a thing or two to say about conflict. Hayter's acting was a stroke of genius, giving the character a growly, harsh tone that reacted violently to opposition, and settled in for something less prickly in the rare instances where he chose to be vulnerable. However, this was Hayter's first time with the character, and the voice did eventually become distinct by the time the sequel, Sons of Liberty, was released. This seems to be the direction he wanted to take in Twin Snakes, as he definitely sounds closer to his MGS2 voice than MGS1, notably in conversations with the DARPA chief.
Slow down. Don't worry. First, I want some information about the terrorists.
The terrorists?
Do they really have the ability to launch a nuke?
What are you talking about?
The terrorists are threatening the White House. They say if they don't accede to their demands, they'll launch a nuclear weapon. Slow down. Don't worry. First, I want some information about the terrorists.
The terrorists?
Do they really have the ability to launch a nuke?
What are you talking about?
The terrorists are threatening the White House. They say if they don't accede to their demands, they'll launch a nuclear weapon.
Psycho Mantis.
I wasn't able to read the future. A strong man doesn't need to read the future. He makes his own.
I wasn't able to read the future.
A strong man doesn't need to read the future. He makes his own.
And Liquid, where there's a lot of back and forth, you can find this distinction.
Fox die. It can't be. Are you telling me Naomi was working with the Pentagon?
They thought she was, but it seems that Dr. Naomi Hunter couldn't be controlled so easily.
What? Fox die? It can't be. Are you telling me Naomi was working with the Pentagon?
They thought she was, but it seems that Dr. Naomi Hunter couldn't be controlled so easily.
What?
Unlike a lot of the cast in this remake, you could tell Hayter was actually doing it for fun. He doesn't sound as bored as Paul Eiding's new Campbell voice, and he still puts in the effort to resemble the character of Solid Snake, unlike Jennifer Hale or Kim My Guest. I'm still kinda on the fence about the performance as a whole, because while this is definitely the way Snake is supposed to sound, there's just something special about the way that he growls at his enemies, or when Snake screams out for Grey Fox after his death. Just like the re-recorded voice lines, Twin Snakes also contains a brand spanking new soundtrack, with the in-game music being composed by Steve Hennepin, who'd previously worked on other Silicon Knights games such as Eternal Darkness and Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. Other music, such as those in the cutscenes and codec calls, were produced by Konami's in-house music staff led by Norihiko Hibino. Metal Gear as a franchise was in a post-MGS2 world, and Harry Gregson Williams helped create a very modern soundtrack for the series going forward. This new techno-infused drum and bass type sound was carried over into Twin Snakes, with barely anything resembling the MGS1 soundtrack being used in the remake. Most notably, the Metal Gear Solid franchise theme song was completely absent, as well as a significant decrease in the amount of times The Best Is Yet to Come was used to supplement the emotional scenes in the game. In fact, I think it was only ever used twice, once in the opening briefing monologue, and again for the theme during the credit roll. Outside of that though, it's obvious to see the tonal divide due to the shift in music direction. MGS1 sounds often like that of a massive undertaking being carried out against an otherworldly force due to the haunting choir and use of string instruments. Twin Snakes tries its best to replicate this, but it often sounds more like a cheesy action movie, using synthesizer riffs and electric drum beats during its intense scenes instead. This is more obvious in the game's implementation of new sound effects during gameplay, as MGS1 used a lot of exaggerated booming noises in its gameplay to accentuate the actions players took. Things like the player's footsteps on grated flooring, explosions from grenades and missiles, even knocking on the walls to get the attention of guards, were all obvious and pronounced. I think this was largely due to the effect of the developers wanting to try and make the levels feel larger than they actually were, or maybe even just to make the player feel small to accentuate how enormous the stakes were as you proceeded through this place all by yourself. The Twin Snakes doesn't seem to be trying to push this same kind of narrative though, as the opposite feeling can be felt throughout the game. Knocking on the walls still alerts the guards if they're within distance, but the noises are much quieter and reflect the material of the walls or objects in a more realistic way. Grated floors and regular footsteps barely sound different, to the point where it's kind of silly that a guard beneath you hears the player crossing a balcony. The only thing I can say with absolute positivity here is that the sound effects of the weapons used are much more hearty and distinctive. The SOCOM pistol has some real ass to it now, and feels like a weighted handgun in Twin Snakes. whereas in the original, before you acquire a suppressor, it's actually just a really loud and obnoxious sound that feels more like you're firing a hand cannon than a gun. The FAMAS rifles and Rex's and Raven's miniguns have a proper wind-up sound before the barrage this time around, and probably the most welcome quality of life changes are the beeping effects of the Nikita launcher and the Stinger missile tracker being less ear-piercing, and don't come on when they aren't supposed to, like what happens in the original. Overall, the sound design of the Twin Snakes is a mess. It's obvious that they wanted to try something new to make it feel different from MGS1, but I think they overcorrected on too many things to make it an improvement over the game. Whether it's the new voice acting, with its sloppy delivery and lack of effort from over half the cast, or the soundtrack itself being so tonally separate from the spirit of the original, or the actions being taken during gameplay itself feeling less impactful because of the SFX changes, there's much left to be desired, and it upsets the balance in an irredeemable way, which is unfortunate because MGS1 prided itself on having a soundscape that delivered a haunting cinematic aspect to it that compensated for the lack of graphical detail. Because of the hard work put into the voice acting and the soundtrack, the player was capable of looking past the odd pixelated faces and really immerse themselves in the complicated narrative being presented. Part of what made a remake of Metal Gear Solid so alluring in the first place was the graphical fidelity of video games during the 6th generation of consoles. The jump from 240p on the PS1 to the 480p on the PS2 alone was incredible enough to warrant several games to get upgraded re-releases on new hardware. Hideo Kojima had also gone into development of MGS2 with the mentality that he wouldn't be working on another title in the franchise at all, so the plot ended on several cliffhangers and open threads that he just never intended on answering. The thought process going into development for Twin Snakes was that they wanted to translate the story of MGS1 to 6th generation while applying all of the freedoms that the new technology had allowed them. A handful of staff from Kojima Productions provided support to the project as development began on another game at Konami, letting some revisions to the script and cinematography occur at Silicon Knights. Ryuhei Kinemura, an action filmmaker who directed the film adaptation of several Japanese manga in the early 2000s, as well as produced Aragami, The Raging God of Battle, and Battlefield Baseball in 2003, directed a majority of the cutscenes throughout the Twin Snakes at Kojima's request. As a director, Kinemura has always been a fan of very dramatic and intense action sequences, opting to use very close-up and shaky camera angles to deliver bombastic, edge-of-your-seat scenes to keep the viewer hooked. Naturally, this would divide the reception to certain changes made in the Twin Snakes. Cutscenes in MGS1 were very slow-paced and deliberate, as it was Kojima's style to provide very cinematic camera angles and prolong character interactions to crank up the drama. The camera often pans around different shots to accentuate the scene, and despite character models not having actual modeled faces, instead having pixelated makeovers to suggest where eyes and mouths should be, the camera never shied away, instead highlighting them when characters had conversations. They were also entirely animated by hand, with an emphasis being put on the stylization of its presentation rather than realism. The Twin Snakes opted for motion capture in nearly all of its cutscenes though. The game was made with the intention to actually mimic that of a live-action military spy thriller, so fully captured faces and bodies were used during production. With the advent of such technology, characters actually had moving faces in-game, and any athleticism was realistic to what a person would be capable of. That is, except for the implementation of Kitamura's signature bombastic action sequences. Several of the original game's cutscenes were changed to meet this new style, such as the M1 tank arrival, the scene where Snake is captured by Sniper Wolf, the Hind D boss battle, and basically every scene with Metal Gear Rex in it. The Twin Snakes was heavily criticized for this aspect of its presentation. Between the completely ridiculous, over-exaggerated action scenes and the constant use of a Matrix-style bullet time effect, cutscenes that used to be threatening directly to the player and ended with intensity instead dipped their toes into the violence just a little bit early for seemingly no other reason than to show off the new animation technology. Character personalities also seem to be just a bit out of touch with their original portrayal as well, with people either performing strangely or just acting differently for the sake of it during cutscenes all throughout this game. Otacon especially was given this awkward limp right up until the end of the game, and he's often seen stumbling around, nervously touching his face, and replacing his glasses often because he just trips so much. This scene where Snake is attacked by guards as he descends to the underground maintenance base is completely blown out of proportion, with the guards emptying their clips in an X-shaped pattern that somehow manages to explode in the middle as Snake jumps out of the way. Revolver Ocelot is shown doing gun tricks with his left hand, and when he does, he fumbles so hard he embarrassingly drops his gun for like no reason at all. He was seen performing with his left hand in a previous scene, so there's no reason to see why this should have happened. As Liquid explains his suspicions about Naomi's betrayal, he not only mounts this railing as a part of a balancing act to intimidate Snake, but he also does a completely stable forward flip without using his hands, landing perfectly without exerting his voice or making a sound at all. But compared to all of that, Solid Snake himself seems to be the worst offender in regards to complete lunatic behavior. In every normal scene where he's talking to a person, he just kind of stands there with this dumb pose with his chest up and his arms out, like he's holding on to an inner tube around his torso, which doesn't make sense to me at all because there are other characters throughout this game that stand like a regular person, with their arms at their sides or across their chest. During his attempted rescue of the DARPA chief, when the guard knocks on the cell door to see why he heard noise, Snake just dips out of the way in the original, behind the door where he can't be seen. In the remake, Snake actually jumps above the door and props himself up in the corner by the ceiling instead. When the guard leaves, he just kinda drops down and carries on the conversation like nothing happened. When Snake encounters the cyborg ninja for the first time in the second floor basement after the Ocelot boss battle, the two are just supposed to have a really tense stare down, but for some reason, the remake decides to implement a combat sequence here, where Snake takes on the ninja in close quarters combat, with a scene where he gets kicked so hard, so far back, it makes Snake's boots smoke, complete with the sound of squealing tires and everything. During the M1 tank ambush, Snake gets fired upon by the tank's main gun, and in an actual improvement on the original, in the remake, Snake gets blown back into the cargo door because of the explosion. But they immediately follow this up with another shot, this time at some nearby barrels by the door, and Snake is thrown to the ground yet again as Raven begins to laugh. During Snake's first encounter with Otacon, he presses the nerd for information regarding the true capability and purpose behind Metal Gear Rex as a nuclear platform specifically. When he doesn't get the information right away, he aggressively reaches out and grabs him by the collar. But in the remake, Snake seemingly has the upper arm strength to lift him off the ground completely and keep him there for over a minute. After Snake defeats defeats Sniper Wolf in a duel in the original, she seemingly disappears, her body having vanished completely when he arrives at her sniping nest. He's shortly ambushed by enemy guards when he approaches a door he doesn't have clearance to, and is apprehended at gunpoint. In the remake, Snake decides to take them all on, holding one of them at a gunpoint, strapping his leg around the barrel of a second one's gun, and immobilizing the third by grabbing his rifle by the barrel. Snake doesn't concede until he's aimed at by Wolf, who reveals she survived her wounds during their battle. There's a scene during the arrival of the Hind D on the communication tower A roof where a missile is launched at the walkway bridge, and the debris gets flung at Snake, and instead of just jumping out of the way or falling to the ground to avoid it, he jumps backward and instead throws a grenade at it, to which the explosion to that one blows him back even farther until he's flung off the side of the tower, dangling from the rooftop. This doesn't happen at all in the original. The bridge is just blown to hell and Snake looks at it all pissed off before Liquid shows up in the Hind. After the helicopter boss battle atop Communications Tower B, Snake encounters Sniper Wolf again in the snowfield below. In the original, the player enters the blizzard during gameplay and marches ahead until they're shot, and he calls Otacon asking for help. The battle ensues like normal and doesn't end until the player has shot down Wolf and left to find her body. In the remake, Snake is somehow able to completely dodge the sniper shot despite not knowing that somebody is aiming at him before taking cover behind a tree for the codec call. When the player deals the final blow, a cutscene plays where Snake gets his PSG-1 shot from his hand, and he follows it up by doing a backflip to break Wolf's line of sight, landing on the butt of the gun to flip it into the air. Then he does a one-armed swing trick to bring the gun up to his sights, and then manages to out-snipe the sniper who had been watching him this entire time through her scope, and she still gets shot. Just like, completely unbelievable. Like, you have to suspend your expectations in this game enough, what with the supernatural feats, the translation of cutscene to gameplay mechanics, and the giant walking nuclear battle tank. But what in the absolute hell is going on in this shot? Speaking of giant walking tanks, the battle with Metal Gear Rex already strained believability. You have a single soldier with a target tracking missile launcher versus a several story high walking tank equipped with ballistic missiles, a laser, and an electromagnetic railgun. Okay, but what if that soldier tried to punch the tank? In the original, Snake just kinda stares up at this behemoth, trying to figure out any way to take it down. But in the remake, he instead charges straight at the thing and is forced back when Rex tries to stomp on him. Playing through these games one right after another is like intentionally giving yourself completely brutal, god-awful whiplash. MGS1 was made from the beginning to be an entry in a military action franchise. It took itself incredibly seriously, except for, when it wasn't, which was rare, and it felt more like an Easter egg in the middle of a spy movie rather than an obvious reference for the sake of it. But for one reason or another, probably due simply to the director's spontaneous additions of bombastic sequences, the Twin Snakes doesn't carry that same cadence. It makes fun of itself almost all of the time, spoiling what few good moments the game actually has. For every scene where Snake and Meryl have actual chemistry, the awkward motion capture of Meryl grabbing Snake seductively exists. For every snide taunt that Liquid dishes at his brother he hates so much, there's a scene of him performing some insane stunt with overdramatic sound cues. Even scenes where the game is directly appealing to the player's sense of humanity, like Gray Fox's death, the game has to follow it up with a cheesy shot of Snake posing with his dead friend's sword as if he's going to use it, but then defiantly shanks it into the ground and again runs toward the giant freaking robot. It seems like these moments during cutscenes were kind of just thrown in there simply to be made into the game without really thinking of the ramifications of what it would do to the tone and atmosphere they were trying to emulate from the original. I mean, For God's sake, after the player rescues the ArmsTech president Kenneth Baker, who fails to recall the frequency to reach Meryl, Snake is just supposed to curse in frustration. But in this remake, this beautifully twisted, tone-deaf remake, not only does Snake get comically pissed about it, ranting and raving as he slaps his thigh and goes stomping off, but he actually draws his gun and points it right at Baker's freaking head. I mean, come on, dude. What is this game? What happened? Somebody get me something for this headache, man. When the Twin Snakes released for the GameCube in 2004, it received fairly good scores from review outlets and positive response from fans everywhere. Metacritic gave the game an 85 out of 100, with reviewers citing the graphics upgrade alone as a huge plus. IGN gave it an 8.5 out of 10 for similar reasons. GameSpot gave it an 8.2 out of 10, saying that, quote, as long as you're not expecting any huge additions, the Twin Snakes serves as a great revival of a true classic. And Game Informer gave the game as high as a 9.2 out of 10, even ranking it at number 11 on their list of top 25 GameCube games of all time in 2009. The Twin Snakes went down with fairly good acclaim upon launch, with the only criticisms mostly centered around the lack of difficulty due to the new mechanic introduction from MGS2 and its tendency for lagging frame rate when the GameCube was taxed with too many things on screen at the same time. The game would remain at the front of the franchise until Kojima Productions finished work on their own title, Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, a prequel game set in the 1960s, centered around the origin story of Big Boss. As of the making of this video, the Twin Snakes hasn't seen a port to any other console in any other generation, forcing players to shell out for a GameCube or a compatible Wii system, and a second-hand copy of the game to play it, legally. So if Twin Snakes went down in official history as a good game, why would I so harshly criticize it in a video like I have today? Well, simply put, I think the game hasn't gotten any better with age. Game development has come a long way since the 6th generation of consoles, not necessarily with graphics alone, but also in terms of mechanics and functionality too. Video games can be complex, and with the constant state of invention of new technology, we can further stretch what a video game can look like in our modern age. The kinds of games that do well nowadays are the many sequels to long-established franchises, with familiar characters being thrust into those new and intricate worlds we create now. It feels really good to see what they can become when introduced to such an ideology, and it feels like developers are taking maximum advantage of what that project should look like in the end. Just look at the sheer number of remasters and remakes we have available to us at this point in time. All of these and more are determinant of what a developer is capable of when creating something new from something old. But if that's the case, then what exactly was the Twin Snakes trying to accomplish with its additions and its subtractions? Thanks to modern retrospect, it seems like public perception of this game has seen an increase in the amount of people who don't particularly care for it, which is a sad thing to be sure, but I think that's all for a good reason. Remaking a video game is generally considered to be for one of two purposes. You're either trying to gauge whether or not there'd be consumer appeal for your product as you attempt to find new sources for profit, or you're directly riding off of the hype of an existing product and looking to capitalize on the name. In the Twin Snakes case, it would have to be for the latter, as the game was constructed specifically to be the definitive way to experience the first Metal Gear Solid. So if this is the case, why does it have to feel so different from the original game? MGS1 is oozing to the brim with cinematic quality, harnessing a film nut's passion for telling a compelling story, while also creating art using revolutionary technology that hasn't been explored in full full yet. Compare that to the Twin Snakes, which cares very little for presenting the original's messages in a respectful way, blatantly makes fun of its narrative and the characters that convey it, and is much less interesting and terribly boring to actually play. The creative spirit has all but perished in this thing, as irritatingly inaccurate recreations of events from the original are spoofed for the sake of it, obvious character assassination for seemingly no reason at all, and the gameplay itself made more complex despite the level design having changed very little from its origin. Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes is the definition of all style and no substance. If the game wanted to be different for the sake of it, then I imagine it's accomplished its mission. A lot of people tell me that I shouldn't try to replace the original with the remake because the two offer such a stunningly different experience. One of them is a cinephile's dream of a military action thriller that you can interact with, and the other is an action movie star's wet dream of what his leading role is really like. One of them provides you with a carefully crafted narrative, interesting level design, and a beautifully melodic soundtrack, and the other implements new technological strides while simultaneously trying really hard to make you remember the Matrix. I guess at the end of it all, we really just have to debate the intent of the developers when considering these games. And since very few of us were actually sitting in on that dev team, we kinda just have to figure it out for ourselves. MGS1 was created as the first 3D entry in the franchise, to be the next logical step and provide a jumping off point to expand the lore of its world. You play this game because it's in a sequence in the story, and there is something worth experiencing here. In contrast, the Twin Snakes was made to be a cash cow, enticing players with nostalgia for the PS1 game and bring the world of Shadow Moses into a new generation. The conversation would end there if it wasn't for this stupid message on the back of the box that declares Twin Snakes to be the way it was always meant to be played. Does that mean that Konami wants you to play this game over that of MGS1? Does that imply that we should value Twin Snakes over the other? In essence, I will always believe that Twin Snakes is an accompaniment to MGS1. In a lot of ways, the remake is more of a dramatic recollection one might have of their memories from the original. You know, when you were young, barely old enough to be playing video games by yourself anyway, the amount of incredible things you'd see on screen would instill you with this amazing feeling of wonder. Your imagination would take over the thing you just saw and blow it up to huge proportions before you retell your experiences to your friends at school, and when you got back home to play it again, you were carried away into another session of amazing video game nuttiness. That's a lot of what like Twin Snakes does for people now. Even with those rose-colored glasses, it's easy to tell the games apart on a fundamental level and what each of them stands for. The remake recognizes what worked in the original and dials the insanity up to 11 before it shoves itself down the player's throat. It focuses so hard on having an incredible presentation about not being identical to what came before that it forgets itself and its purpose. The original prides itself on being a stunning piece of video game history. It tells a story interesting and captivating and makes sure you can have fun playing within its constraints, as well as to make it an unfiltered, undiluted experience. It's fun to play on top of having a wonderful presentation, and that's wholly the difference between the two. You can't get the same experience out of each, and while that may be okay on the outside, to declare the Twin Snakes as the way it was always meant to be played feels like a letdown to me. This thing isn't my Metal Gear Solid. It's not even close. This just isn't even the other one. It's just a shadow living in a world of light. And a bad remake. That's gonna do it for me this time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate each and every single one of you. As always, don't forget to stay awesome, and be kind and rewind. Have a wonderful night. Excelsior.